Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we've been looking at Hadith number 14 from the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi. And last week we started to talk about some of the actual categories mentioned in the Hadith after we spent a long time talking about the had punishments, like what's necessary to enact this in the prism of kind of being in a Islamic kind of country with a mode of governance that's based on Sharia, court system, etc. Everything that goes into due process from the standpoint of our religious tradition. We spent a lot of time talking about like the objectives of Islamic law, the ethic of the sanctity of life within our religious framework, as a foundation to being able to understand now where the particularities here are kind of coming from in relation to this hadith. And then last week we talked about the specifics of the first persons mentioned in this hadith, Athayyib Zani, which is like essentially like the married person who's committing infidelity, or someone who had already previously been married could also be within that grouping. Legalistically, they were widowed or divorced. But that's not then in particular for the people who are not married. And they might be committing zina. Like it's a specific individual that is being mentioned here. So if people can pull up the hadith number 14 of the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, and if we can have somebody read the Arabic and the English, and then we'll try to get through the last two categories of individual mentioned in this hadith. Yeah, go for it.
On the authority of Abdullah ibn Masud, may Allah be pleased with him, who said, the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, said, it is not permissible to spill the blood of a Muslim except in three instances: the married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and one who forsakes his religion and separates from the community.
Jazakallah khair. Can somebody read the Arabic? Are you looking away so I don't call any? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah. One day.
One day. Hadith 14 and the 40 hadith. Oh, people are coming. We thought people were not going to show up because people are confused about the kind of... Yeah, go for it.
لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم يشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأني رسول الله إلا بإحدى ثلاث: الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس والتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة. رواه مسلم والبخاري.
Jazakallah khair. So, I just opened up the live stream to see if it was working, and I forget what I look like sometimes. It's so great. Do you ever forget what you look like? No? Okay, so the second group that's here, right? Essentially a life for a life that's here. It's not necessarily as controversial as potentially the way individuals will make us have doubt in our religion, rooted in the overall idea of how capital punishment works in an Islamic framework, as well as the two groups that are mentioned, essentially like the person who is committing infidelity, and the third grouping of the individual who is essentially committing treason. Do you know? But this second group, a life for a life, if you were to put forth to somebody's engaged in some kind of deliberate homicidal murder, that the option is there now for that person to, if they are tried and go through the same due process, for the punishment of death to potentially be enacted. One of the things that's important, though, is that in Islam, the option is given to the family of the deceased to forgive this person. And that's something that then a court system would abide by. If the family says, we don't want to have this in retaliation, and then Quranically, it's said that that option is the better option to take. So if we look at Surah Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Quran, it's 178th and 179th verses. Can somebody read them? You're just not gonna look it up.
I thought someone was gonna read it.
Please, it's a defiant member of the halakha. Somebody look up Surah Baqarah, verse 178, 179. The Arabic and or the English.
I can do the English.
Yeah, go ahead.
You said 178, 179.
Yep.
You who believe fair retribution is prescribed for you in cases of murder, the free man for the free man, the slave for the slave, the female for the female. But if the culprit is pardoned by his aggrieved brother, this shall be adhered to fairly, and the culprit shall pay what is due in a good way. This is an alleviation from your Lord and an act of mercy. If anyone then exceeds these limits, grievous suffering awaits him. Fair retribution saves life for you, people of understanding, so that you may guard yourselves against what is wrong. When death approaches one of you who leaves wealth, and then keep on.
Sure.
It is prescribed that he should make a proper bequest to parents and close relatives, a duty incumbent on those who are mindful of God.
Okay. Yeah, so can somebody read the Arabic 178, 179, Surah Baqarah?
Just
So did you bring us something to eat?
Oh no, I'm not a nice person. This is from the Saturday brunch.
Did you? So is that for us to eat? Like, are you just leaving?
Nothing like that.
Are you just leaving your trash? What it? Are you gonna read it? You want to read it? Surah Baqarah, verse 178, 179. Oh, this is gonna be a slow night.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم القصاص في القتلى الحر بالحر والعبد بالعبد والأنثى بالأنثى فمن عفي له من أخيه شيء فاتباع بالمعروف وأداء إليه بإحسان ذلك تخفيف من ربكم ورحمة فمن اعتدى بعد ذلك فله عذاب أليم ولكم في القصاص حياة يا أولي الألباب لعلكم تتقون.
So you want to like also know where in the Quran certain things are derived from. So you can also start to extrapolate for yourself a sense of, well, how are people engaging text? And what is it that they are essentially utilizing as tools and methods to derive meaning, whether that are ethics or values, morals, parables, lessons, historical narrative and content, theological principles, doctrinal principles, or like legalistic principles, fiqh principles. So here, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu is giving us an insight that this is going to be something that has some element of like law to it. And then kutiba is utilized the way like many of us are familiar with the verse that talks about fasting, right? Kutiba alaykumus siyam. So when you have this idea that something is written, it is quite often understood that this is one of the modes through which a verse is giving a kind of understanding of something that's going to be kind of a practice that is obligatory. Do you see? And so understanding this now as a base, some of the things that come up for this and questions that would come up, like who are the two parties and when are these two options a potential outcome? Like, do both people have to be Muslim? Does it apply if like one person is Muslim and one is not? The verse is mentioning in particular individuals who are, slaves, they're like women. Like, how do you understand the manifestation of some of these things? And there's different opinions that come across as like Islam develops legislatively, but there's opinions that say like it's a categorical implementation, that the person on both ends could be of any background, and this law of equality or law of retaliation, right, however you want to translate this, is like principally something that would be applicable in any instance, like for the most part, in the particularities of like murder. Do you see? And trying to understand this now also within the frame of what we were talking about before, that the recognition of how this gets put forward necessitates an understanding of like, well, why is this like something that would be there? What's going on in an Arabian experience that Islam is being introduced into? People were killing their daughters because they wanted to have sons, right? This is murder. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not anything other than murder, do you know? A person in a position of authority killing somebody who has lesser authority, societal norms that would allow for these things, right? You have a lot of hadith that people like mention, stories of companions. We read the seerah, things happen. Umar ibn al-Khattab becomes Muslim, and after he becomes Muslim, there's a lot of instances where somebody's bothering the Prophet, and Umar says, why don't we just go kill him? Do you know? Like, no, like, we can't do that. Do you see? The mode in which it's understood as a deterrent that gives an opportunity for individuals who exist now in a stratified society, and they come from lower places of privilege, to have protection through what this verse in this hadith is saying. So it's not just that somebody did something to somebody in the street or in this, and everything, all things were considered equal, and then somebody got killed. But there's instances that take place in large part in this society. Like, if you remember if you come to like the Wednesday halakas on the Sirah, and we talked about months ago what the persecution realities were in the early part of Revelation, or societally what was normative at that time, people were like killing people. And there wasn't necessarily a sense of consequence to it. And the people who didn't really have capacity to have recompense and retribution on their behalf tended to be those who came from like what demographic? Not privileged, but underprivileged and underserved individuals. Do you know what I mean? Who's gonna really combat the elite of Quraysh? Who's gonna go against like the clans of Abdul Muttalib? Who's gonna get away with like even looking in the wrong direction of somebody? Do you know? Right? I don't know if you've ever been around people who have a lot of power before. Do you know what I mean? I was invited to speak at something for a royal family in a country that I won't name. And I was there in two different gatherings. One was like public, and the other was only for members of the royal family. It was in the same room, and they had like a very particular protocol. And I didn't know, right? Like, oh, look at me. I'm in hoodies and a sweatpants. And I'm walking into this place, when they're doing the royal family one, and this like row of people walk in, and I'm standing on the side getting some water, and then I'm walking, and some guy comes up to me, and he's like, "Don't look at them directly." And I'm like, "Don't look at what directly?" Right? And he's like, "This," as they're walking by. I'm like, "There's so many of them, and they're walking in front of me. What am I supposed to do?" And I'm not looking at them. I'm just trying to get back to my seat. Do you know? But there's like assumptions that are there that in that situation, I don't have any sense of recourse. Do you know? When you think about it from the standpoint of sanctity of life, right? When we go through certain things, I've been surveilled, detained, profiled, all kinds of stuff. The frustrating thing isn't that I'm going through it. The frustrating thing is, well, what can I fundamentally do about it? And we go to lots of places in the world, like similar to our country, what's legal doesn't mean that it's just. And so somebody hears a verse like this, and it's mentioning in particular demographics in a religious sphere that are quite often disregarded. The mention explicitly of like women having a right, of slaves having a right. It's hitting up categorically marginalized demographics that when there is justice enacted, quite often people are conditionalizing who actually the law is applicable to in what ways. Do you know? And all these people hearing this are like, my father is not allowed to kill any more of his daughters. I have a certain kind of consequential like retort against somebody who like beats me to death as a servant. Do you see? And it might not resonate in the same way as we think about it while we're within like modernity, but understanding it, especially in that context, and then people start to delineate ethics from this. It's a very obvious ethic. Just like infidelity is bad, right? It is not good for society that people are killing people, right? That's just not fundamentally a good thing. And you know that there's not consequences when it comes to certain life versus other life, right? How many of you have seen all over social media that this grandfather in Gaza, may Allah grant them ease and end the occupation, who was broken-hearted because his granddaughter was killed, right? And he was killed as of recent. Do you know what I'm saying? And the idea is like, well, what exactly? We're talking about things in a prism that, you know, we're not trying to intellectualize, but to illustrate a point. Most people don't really think that that is anything other than collateral damage, the ones who are making decisions, because they don't have like a sanctity of life ethic that we have. Do you see? And so this is not as much of a sense of capital punishment as much as the deterrent variable that says, if you think you can get away with taking someone's life, this is like a consequence to it. Does that make sense? So let's do this just so we can kind of get talking a bit. I know it's a rainy, dark day outside, and Solo bought food that we're not allowed to eat, so we're sad about that. If people want to take a quick minute and turn to the person next to us, like, what do you think are some of the ways we can understand this particular thing? Why would there be, in this instance, this kind of consequence to deter people in this mode? And how is that like an important thing for us to understand in this day and age? And don't think about it in a vacuum. It's not a vigilante religion. It's not empowering vigilantism in this regard. Do you know? None of us in this room have the capacity to that type of recourse, right? It exists only in a certain prism and a certain frame. But let's turn to the person next to us, exchange some names. What are we taking away so far? And then we'll come back and discuss. If you guys want to grab anything from the table, Just while we're doing that too, feel free so that we can kind of finish up what's over there as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it
Yeah, I finished my semester last week. That's why I got back. Because in the summer I got now it's done. So I'm back to where.
Oh, hello. Yeah? What made you come out of hiding?
Huh?
What made you come out of hiding?
I need to focus.
Making sort of like rules that sound harsh to some people, especially the non-Muslims that they like I've said, a lot of those things aren't stuff that it shouldn't necessarily enforce on the day-to-day basis. A lot of things are last resort options, right? Like for example, when people talk about people use the consequence when it says first, speaks of it doesn't work, separate and sleep in different breaths, and this doesn't work. And then it's like after 5 options, then it's just the hitting it, it's not supposed to be a mark at all.
Okay, so what are some of the things that are coming up for people? What are we discussing? Yeah.
We were talking about like how the Hadith said nafs bin nafs, which means one for one. So it's also going to have a frame of who you will be punishing. So don't do like collective punishment. Be fair. Whoever killed this person is the one who should be killed. And reflecting also on what's happening now, especially in Palestine, when they're blaming what happened in October, 6th of October. 1 year ago that, they killed this number of kids, so that's why we're having this war. It's the same thing, like, you're punishing people who have even this happened, but you're punishing people who have nothing to blame. So we reflect on that.
Yeah, we want to distinguish, right? Not in the particulars of what's mentioned here. do you know? But generally understanding that there's distinct modes situationally, right? So conflict, like codes of ethics in times of war, like these are different from like day-to-day individual interactions. And just to say that generally, not in particular, but general understandings, right? Other thoughts, like what we're discussing so far? The crux of what we want to discuss today is like the third category, because that becomes a little bit more of kind of a point of contention. Do you know? Okay, so this third grouping is talking about, in particular, individuals that commit treason. And we want to look at an article similar to what we did last time when we were just talking about the overall engagement of it. So there's another article on Yaqeen's website. It's called The Issue of Apostasy in Islam, that Dr. Jonathan Brown also writes. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we'll read certain sections in order, not sequentially, just to kind of get an idea of what's here. One of the things you want to understand definitively is the Prophet ﷺ never carried out a had punishment for apostasy against anybody. Do you know? And being able to understand like the nuance that gets lost in translation, because we utilize terminologies and their translations from like languages that are not our own. So we're not talking about people who just leave religion, because there's tons of instances during the time of the Prophet and communities that come after that people did not only like leave Islam as a religion, but they still stayed within like communities. The challenge here becomes more around kind of the mode through which one leaves and now becomes adversarial to kind of the state apparatus. Does that make sense? And we see similar parallels in other ways. When you learn religion from individuals that are rooted in Orientalistic tendencies, institutions of whiteness, anti-blackness, they essentially take anomalies to be able to now define what is normative. And they're in a place where they already assume the validity of their argument and handpick data to validate and justify that argument. Does that make sense? And when you have low literacy amongst populations, both Muslim and not, around what Islam actually says, it creates now conundrums like doubt inwardly, as well as opportunities for people to say that our religion is something that it fundamentally is not. Much of this comes to surface when you also have like applications of certain things within locales that do not have the governance structures nor the court systems to implement this, but they're still being empowered through reductive understandings of things. But this point is really important, right? Because you don't want to adopt this also in the way you approach religion. The way we draw meaning from text is exegetical. That's what tafsir is, right? It's exegetical. You're taking meaning from text and you engage text on a whole. What a lot of people do these days is more eisegetical. Like, here's my argument and here's the thing that proves my argument. You can turn a book into anything you want to. That's like a dangerous part, not just of scripture, but of any text. Do you know? People utilize like biblical narrative to validate harmonious existence across diverse communities, and they utilize it to justify transatlantic slave trades. It's the same like stuff. Do you know what I mean? But we're not supposed to be people who take like reductive approaches to religion. And this is what's quite often happening when you have people now who take anomalies and they set it as the norm, because the overall agenda is to make you doubt religion and to have people believe in constructed narratives of fear, things that are fundamentally just not what they kind of claim it to be, do you know? And it's not anything other than objective fact. Like you go to most universities, the people who are teaching about Islam are not Muslims. And the exposure then that's coming from curriculum in most places are either in governmental apparatuses that have curricula that have been heavily influenced by politics, as well as in non-governmental settings, non like Muslim places, but like in American government, they also influence like the development of curriculum, do you know? And we don't want to like learn our religion in that way, right? So people want to pull up this article. It's on the Yaqeen website, The Issue of Apostasy in Islam. And we're going to scroll down. So if we look first, there's a section called Apostasy and the Practice of the Early Muslim Community. So it's the 5th section. After the introduction, religion in the pre-modern world, the new role for religion in the modern and global West, the punishment for apostasy in the Islamic juristic tradition, which we'll read after this section, and apostasy in the practice of the early Muslim community, which we're going to read first. And the whole article, like we probably won't read all together, but that's why we went through the exercise of leading the last one together, so that you go home and read this one. And they make it very easy. What I would suggest is, because they have an audio file, right, that reads the article to you, to retain it more, read it as you're listening to the audio file. Like more of the information will stick in your head. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? So can somebody start Apostasy in the Practice of the Early Muslim Community, the 5th section? It starts the way that the early Muslim community seemed to have understood apostasy. Or actually, before we do that, let's read I'm going to read the introduction really quick. So you all get to that section, Apostasy and the Practice of the Early Muslim Community. If you want to get to the introduction, just scroll back up and read it along with me. The Sharia consists of some laws that remain the same regardless of changing circumstances, and others that change with them. Most of the Sharia is up to individual Muslims to follow in their own lives. Some are for judges to implement in courts. Finally, the 3rd set of laws is for the ruler or political authority to implement based on the best interests of society. The Sharia ruling on Muslims who decide to leave Islam belongs to this 3rd group. Implemented in the past to protect the integrity of the Muslim community, today this important goal can best be reached by Muslim governments using their right to set punishments for apostasy aside. One of the most common accusations leveled against Islam involves the freedom of religion. The problem, according to critics, Islam doesn't have any. This criticism might strike some as odd, since it has been well established that both the religion of Islam and Islamic civilization have shown a level of religious tolerance that would make modern Americans blush. So what are these critics talking about? What they are referring to is not the issue of tolerating those who follow other religions. They are talking about the traditional Islamic punishment for Muslims who leave their own religion, known as rida or irtidad in Arabic. This is usually translated as apostasy in English, the generic act of renouncing or leaving one's religion. Like the issues of stoning and hand chopping, apostasy in Islam can only be understood if one is willing to look beyond provocative headlines and delve into the nature of how jurisprudence developed in the pre-modern world, and Islam in particular. As with these harsh punishments, modern confusion over apostasy in Islam has less to do with some basic flaw in Islamic scriptures and more to do with a major development in human history, namely the greatly diminished role of religion in the law and governance of modern societies. Though we'll refer to rida as apostasy for the sake of convenience, as in so many cases, the heart of the matter lies in the simple act of translation. In the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in the early Muslim community, the Arabic noun rida and the verb for engaging in it were understood not as meaning a personal choice of changing one's religion, but as the public act of political secession from the Muslim community. Interestingly, this dimension of apostasy as betraying and opposing one's community, missing in the normal usage of the English word apostasy, is actually recovered in sociological studies of apostasy. Many studies looking at those who leave religious groups as well as communities defined by secular ideologies show that what distinguishes apostates from those who simply leave is that apostates become active opponents of their previous identity, more renegades than mere dissenters. Along the same lines, the problem with Rida in Islam was not that a person was exercising their freedom of conscience and choosing to no longer follow the religion. The problem was when such a decision became a public act with political implications. So this is kind of a foundational framework of what our definition is of terminologies, not somebody else's definition. And as a fundamental principle, you want to understand this, because when you talk to someone from a different religion and you say something even as simple as like God, the essential understanding of God is different. If you say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the word prophet through an Islamic framework is different from other frameworks. Right? A prophet in Islam is somebody who has impeccable character, somebody who does not commit transgressions against people. All the things that we know. If you look at other religious traditions, they have examples of prophets who are committing incest, prophets who are engaged in treacherous acts, right? And I'm not saying it in a comparative mode of what's better or worse. I'm saying from the standpoint of language, we learn the meanings of things through the names of things. And you're learning the meaning of what this means on our terms, not somebody else's terms. Does that make sense? So the foundation of it becomes important, just like any other word, right? You gotta know at this phase, what does rahma actually mean? What does sabr mean? What does iman mean, right? All kinds of words, what do they actually mean? Because people will turn your identities against you if you don't have foundational understanding. And Islam is a knowledge-based civilizational experience rooted in an oral recitation of Quran that has miraculous impact just through words that are being recited, right? So you can't undermine the importance of words. Do you see what I mean? So this is our working definition of what this is. The public act of political secession from the Muslim community. Does this make sense? Not just somebody left the religion. Do you know? It's too simple of a definition. Does that make sense? So when we look at now this section, apostasy and the practice of the early Muslim community, it's going to delve into it a little bit deeper. Can somebody start reading the way that the early Muslim community seems to have understood apostasy? Yeah, go for it.
The way that the early Muslim community seems to have understood apostasy differs strikingly from the decisive rulings of the later schools of law. This is most clear in the rulings of the Prophet ﷺ himself. There is no reliable evidence that the Prophet ﷺ ever executed anyone for apostasy, as was observed by the famous scholar of Cordoba, Ibn al-Tala, when one of his companions, Ubaidullah bin Jahiz, left Islam and became Christian while the Muslims were seeking refuge in Ethiopia. The Prophet ﷺ did not order him punished. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, right? Which the Prophet ﷺ concluded with the Quraysh, stated that if anyone decided to leave the Muslim community in Medina, no harm would befall them. There was no mention of a punishment for apostasy. In fact, when a man who had come to the Prophet ﷺ just the day before to pledge his loyalty to Islam wanted to be released from his oath, the Prophet ﷺ let him go. Imam al-Shafi himself notes how during the Prophet ﷺ's time in Medina, some people believed and then apostatized. Then they again took on the outer trappings of faith, but then the Messenger of God did not kill them.
Okay, it's pretty straightforward, right? A Meccan experience is different from a Medinese experience. Nobody had like a vested interest in Mecca to like to there's no benefit to being Muslim in Mecca the way in Medina when they have a community, right? In Mecca, outside of the first couple of years, where they're in a private propagation of Islam, and they're not like really doing anything publicly, but you then go into the next decade plus in the Meccan experience, and it's filled with persecution, boycotts, killings, right? Like the Muslims are being deeply hurt and mistreated. Do you see what I mean? And there's not like the same experience, but now when you're in Medina, you have like those people who came from Mecca that are in Medina. You have like people who are new to Islam in Medina. You also have a category of people who claim Islam, but they are called the munafiqeen, right? They outwardly express it and they inwardly reject it. They don't exist in the first like period in Meccan Islam, right? And kind of the seerah that's taking place in Mecca. But it makes sense, right? Like, why would there be somebody in Mecca where they're being persecuted that would outwardly express it and inwardly detest it? In Medina, they can have these benefits. And then there's people who are still trying to figure out, like, what does this stuff mean to me? Do you know? How does it make sense, right? But in particular, there are instances where we see the norm was not simply just somebody changed religions, and this is important, right? And like there's nuance to language, right? But the specifics are like they were Muslim and they're no longer Muslim, and the Prophet didn't like do what this hadith is saying, meaning like that's not what that means. Do you get what I mean? Let's continue. Does somebody want to keep reading? This is equally clear in the conduct of the early caliphs. You want to keep reading?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is equally clear in the conduct of the early caliphs. When 6 men from the Bakr bin Wali tribe apostatized during a campaign in southern Iran, the leaders of the army had them killed. When the Caliph Umar was informed of this, he upbraided the commanders. Had he been making the decision, the Caliph explained, he would have offered the men a way back in from the door they took out, or he would have put them in prison. When the pious Ubayyid Khalif Umar bin Abd al-Aziz was told that a group of the recent converts to Islam in northern Iraq had apostatized, he allowed them to revert to their previous status as a protected non-Muslim minority.
Okay, right? And so ahkam are like different. Like we have hukam that we follow individually, right? Like Fajr, you gotta pray at Fajr time. You know what I mean? In Sharia, essentially, there's like a hukam for pretty much everything. Do you know? More or less, right? And it's not always just fard and haram, like obligatory and strictly prohibited. There's also like recommended, mustahab, there's makruh, disliked, and then there's mubah, like it's permissible, do you know? Then in the Hanafi school, they interject like not a 5 category set of ahkam, but like 7 categories. So they add wajib between fard and mustahab, like what is necessary. And then makruh gets broken into makruh tahrimi, like closer to haram, and makruh tanzihi, like a little, it's on the other end, closer to what is mubah, right? Like permissible, do you know? So it's just, a lot of stuff is just permissible. Do you know what I mean? I can buy gray sweatpants, I can buy blue sweatpants, do you know? Like this, it's fine. Do you see, right? But now you have, like what he outlined in the beginning, there's these 3 categories of ahkam, and the ahkam, like, are of day to day, of the judge, and then there's of the person who's a ruler. And that like sultani ahkam is like some of what's being defined here. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he's like making a decision. What do we do in these situations, right? So why does he do this? Do you see? And if there's not room to maneuver around it, it would have been different. And if the hadith that we're looking at meant that if this happens, then this must happen, then there wouldn't be room to do it differently. Do you get? And where the rhetoric comes in, you could go Google online or go on YouTube, and you can see all kinds of people who engage now in this mode of reflection because they're taking approach of anomalizing rare instances and setting those to be the norm to be able to prove the argument, but not taking into account all of the data that goes in. Like, why are these people like constantly saying Islam X, Y, or Z? And they're not, look at all the hadith that we looked at before. Love for your brother what you love for yourself, right? لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. That not one of you will have complete iman until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And Imam Nawawi, whose book we're looking at, he says that word brother, and by extension sister in the hadith, is not in relation to your brother in faith, but your brother in humanity. Do you know? Why aren't they like telling people about those hadith? Do you see what I mean? Right? Why are they only like cherry picking particulars? It's not even like an honest system of data collection, right? And if you don't look at what the entirety of it is, you can isolate and make something into whatever you want to fundamentally. But you look at like historical understanding, this isn't something that they were doing. And this is what somebody else is telling us our religion is when it fundamentally isn't. Should we continue? Even the worst examples of patience and tolerance. Yeah, go ahead.
Even the worst examples of patience and tolerance in the early Islamic period, the Kharijite extremists, seem to have been at least partially misunderstood by later scholars on the apostasy issue. Their policy of killing any other Muslims whom they saw as having committed grave sins is usually explained by them having concluded that these people were apostates. Their supposed reasoning: if sinners really believed in God, would they commit sins? But according to an early Kharijite source, the Kharijites seem to have done so more because they viewed their opponents as having egregiously defied God's law than because they were seen as apostates, pure and simple. After the Muslim armies conquered the city of Bukhara in 673-674 CE, its inhabitants kept converting to Islam and then returning to their previous faith of Zoroastrianism as soon as the Arab armies left town. The army had to keep returning to re-establish discipline. At no point was anyone killed for this. Keep going.
Yep.
Of course, some people were executed for apostasy in the early Islamic period. Yet, in instances where details are provided, what stands out is their public nature. The apostasy occurs not in private, but comes with a very public announcement by the person in question. This is exemplified in the famous story of the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh, reportedly executing a man named Al-Mustawrad al-Ijli for converting to Christianity. Although reports of this event overall are unreliable according to most Muslim scholars, what seems to have condemned Al-Mustawrad was not converting, but rather rubbing this in Ali's face publicly. A recent study of books in which Arab Christians detailed the heroic exploits of Christian saints under Muslim rule bolsters the impression that apostasy was punished only when it was perceived as a threat to public order. These Christian lives of saints works tell of a number of Muslims who embraced Christianity in the early Islamic period. According to these stories, each apostate/saint made a public confession of his new faith, and each was subsequently executed. The one story in which the apostate was not executed, a case in 10th century Egypt, was a man who was told by the monks he joined that he had to repudiate Islam publicly. He did not, however, and he was never executed. despite his own father writing to the caliph asking to have his son put to death. In fact, the man lived out his life as a monk, establishing a monastery, and even writing Christian criticisms of Islam that survive until today.
So how does this happen, right? We're talking about this in a space that has a mode of governance that's rooted in Islam as a religion, the purposeful strategy in certain kind of historical accounts to be able to kind of sanctify individuals through this process. But it wasn't that they were engaged in merely a departure from Islam as a religion. They would depart and then they would basically engage in what was kind of a outcry, bringing like challenge to public order, do you know, in a way that was detrimental to like what our religion would allow for at that time. You wouldn't see this different in any other governmental apparatus. The act of somebody leaving and committing what is like betrayal in the form of treason. You could look at the United States and you could see individuals who are like literally like, if I called you a Benedict Arnold, I'm referring to you as a traitor, you know? That's like kind of what it denotes, because this is who Benedict Arnold was. But if you go and you understand him in a different narrative's experience, he's hailed as heroic, right? Because he was committing this act in a way that was treasonous to one and kind of, you know, heroic to another. Do you see what I mean? There's 2 paragraphs left. Maybe we can just read those as well. Does anybody want to read? How Muslim states dealt with apostasy. You want to read?
Yeah, go for it.
How come people don't like reading?
I could talk for hours.
Yeah?
Yeah, you know this. Do you want me to finish the?
I can talk for hours too.
Yeah, I know. That's why we get along.
That's why that's why we're best friends. Yeah.
Yeah, we are besties.
Uh-huh.
Bestie, do you want me to finish the section?
Please,
Okay, cool.
I appreciate it.
Of course. How Muslim states dealt with apostasy throughout the pre-modern era shows a similar concern with apostasy only when it became a public matter. A renowned Arab poet, Abu al-Ala al-Mari, was openly skeptical about prophecy and formal religions, mocking the Hajj and writing, "There are 2 types of people in the world, people with brains and no religion, or people with religion and no brains." Al-Ma'ari died of natural causes, as did numerous other famous freethinkers in the medieval Islamic world. Similar findings come in a recent study of 60 cases in which people were executed for apostasy or other types of heresy during the Mamluk period. Those who were executed for declaring their apostasy were mainly Christians who had converted to Islam and then made a public show of renouncing it, as in the case of 2 Coptic Christians in 1383 and a whole group in 1379. In the latter case, they were given numerous chances to recant their apostasy before being punished. Later in the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim who had converted to Christianity and became a monk was brought to court to repent before a judge. When the judge offered the man coffee, presumably Turkish, he threw it in the judge's face and began cursing Islam. The judge decided the man was insane. Only after he publicly insulted Islam 3 more times was the man executed.
So the idea here is that within kind of a societal understanding, they're out there kind of just calling towards things that are creating like public dissent, right? But not in a prism of governmental apparatus or we are anti like the authoritative structure. They're basically trying to, in a public sense, like remove what it is that would in a Muslim community be what a Muslim community would define as societal public order. But as you're hearing of poets who are essentially like praising atheism and mocking religion. And when they say they die of natural causes, it means they were just like left to be whoever it is that they were. Do you know? But where somebody is now openly advocating as being not like an enemy of the state in the way we understand statehood and nationalistic identity to be, you know, within a contemporary setting, but they're in a place where like their mode of engagement is something that's detrimental to the social fabric. You see, not like any one instance, but Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, like he's in a place where people were like, we're just gonna do our own thing, and they let them do it. You go to Ottoman Islam, which like many people go and look to Ottoman Islam, where they established Jewish religious courts and like other religious courts, so people could go to their own leadership, like for their own kind of needs. And you can see that in historical record, people of other faiths still quite often went to Islamic court systems because they knew they were going to get justice in those systems. But the idea wasn't that like religions couldn't be practiced or it had to be private. Like you can literally go to places like Cordoba, and built into the actual walls are the presence of multiple religious symbols, all like on one wall. Convivencia is something that flourished. Judaism flourishes in Islamic Spain. That's just a reality. Do you know what I mean? It's not at odds with other religious traditions or other religious norms or these kinds of things. Does this make sense? The idea here, though, is for us to understand that somebody else telling us that your religion says if somebody leaves the religion, then automatically they should be put to death. This is just a lie. It's not true. You can tell a lie like enough times that people start to believe it, right? But that doesn't make it what's true. And you gotta like get to places where you engage in, well, what does my religion actually say? And what is practice? Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu an, when he is told of these people, we read it a few paragraphs ago, he says, like, you should not have done this. This is what I would have done. Given them a way out, or at a minimum, or like in a worst case scenario, he would have put them in prison, right? Umar ibn al-Khattab is like, under his caliphate, the community grows substantially. And he's still also, like when he goes to Jerusalem and is given the keys to the city, he lets the churches exist. He lets everything exist. The only reason he says, I'm not praying in the church, isn't because we're not allowed to pray in churches. But he said, I don't want to set a precedent of praying in the church, and then Muslims come and they take over your churches, right? He's letting people like do their thing. Do you see what I mean? We're not like functioning in a way that that's what it is. But like if somebody is now building institutionally systems that now are going to contradict and they're going to engage in things that challenge what is like a reasonable sense of a social order in a community, and they're still letting these guys like engage in the stuff that they're engaging in, it goes back to a lot of what we talked about in the beginning. Like it's not for the everyday person to just determine this is what I think we should be doing here. Like there has to be some knowledge base and accountability to that knowledge base. And there's gradations of who then gets to carry this stuff out. And we don't exist in a place where like we have the capacity to say the had punishment needs to be enacted here. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, let's take a minute because we went through this whole section. If you can turn to the people next to you, what are you taking away from this part of the conversation so far? What is it bringing up for you? And then we'll come back and discuss, but go ahead.
I volunteer. Well, it puts into perspective kind of disingenuous, if that's a word, of a lot of the Catholics and the enemies of Islam, right? They always fail to do their due diligence anytime they come to attack the religions. And that's the beauty of Islam. When there's always a reason and explanation behind when they would be able to attack it, right? And there's always context, right? That puts everything into line. The Christian, the enemies of Islam, they purposely neglect the context and the history behind everything, and then they say it as if it's as simple as someone says, I'm no longer Muslim, and then we're like, okay, now we have to have these it's not this simple, right? So, and we see this showing one of hundreds of things that they say is within perspective the importance of learning your religion, right? Because most people, if they don't take the time to learn this, some people, they might be talking to someone who might be interested in Islam or Islam, and they get caught off guard when they hear something like killing apostates, and they don't know how to respond, right? And then they think they automatically won because they're talking to someone who doesn't have the knowledge to combat. It's the importance of learning your religion, right? And especially topics that you know that are often going to come up against non-believers. They always bring up three major topics. Right? It's always the it's always killing of apostates, everything. It's always the same thing. Right? So at the very least, learn these, right? And to be able to combat these. But I'll give it to the next person. I wouldn't even say it's defensive, I was just saying it's facts. It's defending the word. Educated. Just the basics.
Or to go back.
Okay, what are some of the things that are coming up for people? What are we taking away from this conversation so far? What do we discuss? Yeah.
Just a quick thing that we discussed was kind of on the same theme of when we read the previous article about how many excuses were made to not carry out the Hajj punishment. So the ending of what we read, where it was saying that, you know, the judge gave him coffee, he threw it in his face to like try and declare him insane. I'm assuming if someone is insane, you can't carry out the Hajj punishment. So, you know, like he was really trying not to like execute this man, but then he went on and insulted Islam a few more times. But It's just, yeah, the mercy aspect carrying forward is like,
Yeah, and then there's accountability, right? Like it's not a joke. Just like somebody took someone's life, you essentially are taking their life, even institutionally. You're gonna have to explain to God why you're doing this thing. Do you know what's the basis of that? You see? When you look at contemporary situations that come up, right? People get confused by terminologies, and there's all kinds of people who like say things they don't know what like Islamic terms mean. You know, like fatwa. Like most people don't really get what a fatwa is. Do you know what I mean? Huh?
No,
Do you
I'm saying,
agree?
like, some people, like, I was just adding on to it, like, some people hear the word jihad and they take it to another
Yeah, 100%, right? And it's like very different today than it might have been 10, 15 years ago on certain rhetorics, but the way certain things kind of come to surface in geopolitical realities, how they get conflated with religion, and because of other things, like we don't have a lot of presence, not because we don't try, but that's just like you live in a white world, right? And so that's just what it is. So like you could scream all kinds of things all day and night, but other people get to control how it is that narrative is constructed and what gets shared on television and whatever else, right? But the idea here is that you don't have doubt in your religion, do you know? And knowledge is empowering, right? Ignorance is not blissful in our religion. Do you know what I mean? And there's a difference between like not knowing something versus being willfully ignorant. And then you get knocked down because like somebody is teaching you your faith who wants you to become self-loathing. Do you see? Let's go to the section that says the punishment for apostasy in the Islamic juristic tradition. So that's the section before the one we just read. And we'll read this one and then we'll wrap up for today. Anybody want to read? The one right before it. The punishment for apostasy in the Islamic juristic tradition. So the section we just finished, the one that is right before it. Alhamdulillah.
In the public and cosmic order of the abode of Islam, that grand fabric of diverse kingdoms and peoples bound together by a belief in Islam's legal order. Am I reading the right paragraph?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
great.
It's Monday, forgive me y'all. And in belonging to the community Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's not surprising that the official punishment for apostasy was severe. In part, this was because, as we have made clear elsewhere, pre-modern legal systems relied on severe punishments to make up in deterrence effect what was lacking in effective policing and law enforcement. But mainly what shaped the Muslim juristic tradition's position on apostasy from Islam was how it understood order and identity. This influenced the rules on apostasy more than any clear prescription in the Quran or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teachings. Keep going.
Yeah, you can keep going.
In all the classical schools of Sunni and Shiite Islam, the punishment for a Muslim apostate, murtad, was death. The jurists also agreed that only the ruler could order this punishment carried out, and that vigilantism would be punished, just as only a court or qualified judge can declare someone an unbeliever. The ruling on apostasy was based primarily on the three hadiths in Sahih al-Bukhari. First, the companion Ibn Abbas reported that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whoever changes their religion, kill them. Second, Murab bin Jawal told another companion, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, that executing the apostate was the ruling of God and his messenger. And the third, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that a Muslim could only be executed for crimes of murder, adultery, or apostasy.
Okay, so it's laying a foundation, right? Of like, how do you get to this? What are common opinions? Like, where there's unanimity, but it's not in a vacuum. It's based off of what we were talking about before and kind of giving like a setting into where they kind of go. And now he's going to break down some of this a little more concretely because Can somebody keep reading? These reports provide excellent examples. Yeah.
These reports provide excellent examples of how hadiths must be read in the light of external evidence. First, the command of the Prophet ﷺ to kill anyone who changes their religion cannot be taken on its face, since it's obvious that people changing their religion to Islam was not a crime. It was laudable, and changing religions from Christianity to Buddhism, for example, was of no consequence. So the hadith must be understood as warning only those who leave Islam.
So he's saying like a very important thing, right? These reports provide excellent examples of how hadith must be read in light of external evidence. Because if you just took it reductively for what it said, like just the act of changing religion is what it's saying, right? If someone changes their religion, then X. So anybody changes religion from something to something, that's like what it is. And this is how sometimes people read Hadith and Quran. Like they take words, sentences, segments, and they say, this is what it says, so this is what it must mean. But this clearly cannot mean like what it literally is saying. Do you see? Go ahead, keep going first.
Similarly, it was not a crime to outwardly renounce Islam out of fear for one's safety as long as one still believed in one's heart, as it is clearly stated in the Quran, chapter 16, verse 106. Finally, apostasy is only considered if the person doing it is of sound mind, an adult, and for the Hanifa school of law, and several opinions and the other schools sober.
Right, and this is like a common thing in terms of what makes somebody like mukallaf, like they are now at a place where things are obligatory upon them. So like my son is 9, like he is not an adult, so Fajr is not fard upon him. Do you know what I mean? And it's weird for me to think of my son as a grown man. Inshallah, he's a grown man one day, right? But there's like that requirement. Like you are post-pubescent, and that becomes like an age of discernment. And then you have to be Muslim, like for Sharia to be applicable to you in certain regards. So I can't walk down the street and somebody's not Muslim, like it's Maghrib time, why aren't you praying? They're not Muslim. To be of sound mind is very important. Like if you do not have mental faculties or capacities that don't have to have continuity to it. You can also have inclinations that are episodic, things that are like temporary, and temporary is not just for like minutes or hours, but like things that go for weeks or months, right? And there's kind of experiences that people have in terms of like conditions. And our tradition makes exemptions of all kind. So exemptions are not just for like physical wellness conditions, but also emotional, like mental wellness conditions. Do you know what I mean? And then the idea of sobriety is also important, right? But there's kind of different opinions on some of that. But it's giving us an insight on like, well, what's going on here and what kind of questions that people wrestle with. So you're understanding what something is by knowing what it's not and where is it not applicable. Does anybody want to continue? Such qualifications might seem obvious. Yeah.
Such qualifications might seem obvious, but once it's clear that statements like the above hadith should not be taken categorically or according to their evident meaning, a host of interpretive possibilities are opened up. For example, Muslim scholars agree that authority should only concern themselves with external expressions of apostasy, not people's private religious practice. This is clear from the overall Sharia principle that the law does not seek to know what is in people's hearts. The Prophet ﷺ had warned Osama bin Zayd that he could not know if someone's conversion was sincere unless he could open up his heart. The Prophet ﷺ himself is reported to have said, "I have not been commanded to search in the hearts of men or to open them up." Imam Shafi noted that the Prophet ﷺ dealt with people according to their external professions of faith, even when he knew they were apostates or unbelievers in their hearts. Even when God had given the Prophet ﷺ direct knowledge of someone's hidden apostasy, that person's external adherence to Islam made their life and property inviolable.
Yeah, so like the Prophet knows who the munafiqeen are, right? He entrusts Hudayfa radiallahu anh with this information because they went to all different extents. Abdullah ibn Ubay was the chief of the hypocrites. He played a key role in the slander against the Prophet's wife, the Hadith al-Ifk. When he dies, like the Prophet stands for his janazah because there hasn't been kind of revelation that prohibits this directly in that way. And so Umar says, like, don't you know who this is? This is Abdullah ibn Ubay. Here's all the stuff that he did. And the Prophet says, Ya Umar, like Allah says in the Quran says, like, you can seek forgiveness for them or not seek forgiveness. Even if you seek their forgiveness 70 times for them, they won't be forgiven. And he said, if I have to stand on this man's grave and seek forgiveness on his behalf 71 times, I will do so, right? Like, it's the basis of our religion. It's not like meant to be something platitudinal or like this is what it is, right? He sent rahmatan lil alameen. Like, that's his purpose. Do you know? So he's working within the confines that give him allowance based off of what Allah has determined. The Prophet cannot negotiate or compromise on the fara'id or the maharim, but like he's in a place where like there's room to operate. He's operating on his default settings, right? And so when now there's like an insight that like the janazah is held and somebody's not going to pray for the maghfirah of the munafiq, but everybody doesn't need to know that that person's a munafiq. The Prophet tells Hudayfa radiallahu anh before he passes. Umar asked Hudayfa about this list, and Hudayfa says that the Prophet ﷺ told me I can't tell anybody, and Umar says, I don't want to know if anybody else is on this list. Can you tell me if my name is on the list, right? Because in this kind of state of constant like self-inventorying, you're not policing other people's behavior, and this is a religion that gives you privacy. Like, you can go into your home, and that's why like you don't want to like engage religion as a entertaining experience, like as an educational experience. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that we read in that last article. Do you know what I mean? And who was the person that was told, like, you're not supposed to be in my house? Umar ibn al-Khattab is the one that went into someone's house and told them they can't do what they're doing. And that person said, to tell me one wrong, you did 3 wrongs. He's got a right to privacy. Do you know? Like, that's something that's there, right? And this is like I don't know if it comes later in the article. It'll come later in the article, so we can read that part. But it's like you start to understand also like the ethic and the methodology that's prophetic. You know, the Prophet's not trying to catch you in a gotcha moment, right? Like, this is not what it is. Do you know what I mean? And these are serious things, but he's still enabling what is the foundational ethos, and privacy is a big part to that. As is this idea that like you don't know what's in someone's heart. Osama ibn Zayd is super close to the Prophet of God. He's the son of Zayd ibn Haritha and Ayman Barakah, 2 companions that the Prophet loves deeply. Zayd ibn Haritha at one occasion was so close to the Prophet, he's known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. And then when verses are revealed saying you can't assume the natal identity of anyone, right? Like, you're always the son of your father, no matter what. Because you can't go in and like usurp orphans' wealth and claim it for your own. They get to have their stuff. You don't get to have it. Because like the Sharia has fail-safes for a lot of things. Because a lot of people are garbage human beings at the end of the day. Do you know what I mean? So they'll take kids. Oh, I love you. You're now my child. And then they're trying to just take their money. No, like their stuff is their stuff. You can have a bond of kinship. You can adopt. You can do all this stuff. That's not haram. But like, you don't get that kid's wealth. Do you know? Does that make sense? And so Osama ibn Zayd is the son of these people. Ayman Barakah is arguably the only companion of the Prophet who's with him from the day he's born until the day he dies. That when people like Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhuma, they were sad after the Prophet's passing, they'd go talk to Ayman Barakah about like the Prophet because of her relationship. Osama bin Zayd is their kid. And he's in a battle and he takes somebody's life after that person says La ilaha illallah to contextualize. And then the Prophet says to him, Lima qataltahu, then why did you kill him? Right? What are you going to do, Osama, when he comes carrying that La ilaha illallah against you on the day of judgment? Do you know? أَقَتَلْتَهُ بَعْدَمَا قَالَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Did you kill him after he said La ilaha illallah? This is where he says, did you open up his chest and look into his heart to see this is why he did this? Right? The transition is one of, you're not policing someone else's iman, you are policing your own. But if somebody is now standing in the street and creating public disorder, there has to be a mechanism to maintain social order. That's not the same as, hey man, I don't think I believe in this thing anymore. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? And then people go through like a lot of tough stuff, right? There's people who go through like such hell. May Allah make it easy for them. In the name of people using religion against them. And then they struggle with recognizing like, well, if this is what your religion is, like how do I make sense of it? Do you know what I mean? And that's why you need to have people who have compassion and understanding and they're talking to you and they're not making you feel like when you're broken, that your brokenness is somehow your fault. And there's an understanding of like, well, what really brings somebody to these places? Let's continue. This principle became enshrined in the scholarly maxim. Anybody want to read?
The principle enshrined in the scholarly maxim that the rulings of Sharia concern the immediate and the outward, and God concerns himself with what is in the heart. إنما الأحكام بالظاهر والله والله يتولى الظاهر.
Right, so the dhahir, right, is what is outward, right? It's in contrast to what's inward, right? Sara'ir is like what is hidden, do you know? So Allah knows what's hidden. Like, I don't know what's hidden. You don't know what's going on with me. Do you know what I mean? But like, there's certain things that exert manifestation of the, like there's not neutrality on certain things. Do you know? Right? So like, I can't say you don't know what's in my heart. That's why, like, God forbid I abuse my child. Right? There's no neutrality to that. It's wrong. Do you see? Right? But like, you don't know like certain things, like why someone behaves in certain ways. An assumption is a problem. And so from the standpoints of fiqh, like you can only deal with what's outward. And that creates like the recognition that like, hey, if somebody's engaged in an act of what is determined to be public indecency, and you're in a Muslim community and it's run by Islam, and people are walking around the way like you walk through Amsterdam and there's people like pulling you into buildings to engage in like physically intimate acts, right? Like this is happening on the streets. It doesn't create like a social order from an Islamic framework. You see what I mean? They got to deal with what is outwardly happening. But then when they're sitting down with people, they're going to try to break it down for them. Because what? Like the hadith we looked at in the last part of this, right? The Prophet says like ward off the hudud, you know, err in mercy. Like that's better, right? Than erring in the convictions. Do you see what I mean? But you got to still like put a stop to certain things. Does that make sense? Let's continue with that. Do you want to keep reading, Faris?
I lost my spot.
Okay, that's fine. Does anybody want to pick up purposely overlooking? Yeah, go ahead.
Purposefully overlooking the condition of individuals' private faith fit under the larger Sharia principle of respecting privacy, avoiding tajassus, seeking out offenses done in private that don't infringe on others' rights, and providing satr, finding excuses for or turning a blind eye to private misconduct as long as it doesn't violate the rights of others. These concepts were rooted in the Quran, which forbids tajassus, and the Sunnah, where the Prophet ﷺ repeatedly ignores a man trying to confess to having violated one of the hudud. If you seek out people's secret or shameful areas, the Prophet ﷺ warns, you'll ruin them. None of this meant that Islam did not value sincerity or people's outward conduct stemming from their inner faith. But from the perspective of the law, it was only outward performances of faith that could be measured. Anything else is impossible to assess with any certainty.
So do people understand like where the privacy thing also has a limitation, right? Like I can't go into someone's house and they're like clearly like trafficking children. They're like, I have a right to privacy, you know? Like no, like this is a gross violation of behaviors. Do you see what I mean? Right? So there's like elements that infringe on the rights of others and whatever else. So we don't want to have like a sense here. But the tajassus, like suspicion, is like a big problem in our religion's code of ethics. You know, you're not supposed to be people who are like just innately suspicious of others, which is not like understanding things in a vacuum. It's a reasonable, like if I've been in a place where I've been abused or mistreated, that when I went to speak to these kids from Gaza, may Allah make things easy for them, severe medical needs, I'm sitting with them, like many of them lost their entire families in front of their eyes. The ones who still had some living relatives with them, grandmothers are saying to me, like my 6-year-old granddaughter, whenever she sees a grown man, she starts screaming. We're not gonna say that that girl is suspicious of men and she has a problem. She's living in a reality that has impacted her ability to trust somebody. That's very different from like what the tajassus is. Do you understand? And understanding like where suspicion in those frames become deeply problematic. And to me, like this is a very important like hadith. If you seek out a people's secret or shameful areas, you'll ruin them, right? Because everybody's got like stuff, you know what I mean? But why would you want to be that person? Like that's like your goal in life. Let me go find what people's like hidden darkest kind of secrets are. Do you know? That's not the point of all of this. You see what I mean? It's not like that kind of assessment tool. I can't believe, do you know so-and-so listens to this, or I saw them talking to this person or that person. Grow up in your Islam, right? That's what you reduce like things to, then you're gonna get out of it what you put into it. Do you see what I mean? But from the perspective of law, it was only outward performances of faith that could be measured. Anything else is impossible to assess with any certainty. You know, you can only go based off of the outward. You can't like do anything else because how can you understand that like from the prism of the inward? Okay, we have 2 more paragraphs here, right? Does anybody want to finish these last 2 paragraphs?
I can wrap it up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Muslim scholars have disagreed on 2 other details of apostasy. The Hanafi school differs with the other schools of law in holding that women apostates are not killed but only imprisoned. They base this on a hadith considered reliable by Hanafis in which the Prophet ﷺ banned killing women who left Islam. The majority of Muslim scholars, however, consider this hadith to be unreliable and instead follow the principle that men and women are treated equally in hudud punishments. Second, scholars disagreed on whether a Muslim who had renounced their religion should be given a chance to repent. 3 Sunni schools of law required giving them a chance, and the Hanafis considered it recommended. The vast majority of Muslim scholars held that this opportunity to recant should be given based on a set of hadiths in which the Prophet ﷺ mentioned giving apostates a chance to change their minds, as well as on the precedent of the Caliph Omar. Most legal scholars gave a period of 3 days or 3 chances, and Ibn Hanbal and Abu Hanifa gave opinions that the accused person should be given a month to repent. The famous scholar Ibn Hazm reported one opinion that the apostate should be asked if they want to recant until forever, on the basis of a statement by Umar and a ruling by the early jurist al-Nakhai, though al-Nakhai probably meant that a repeat apostate should be given a chance to repent every time.
Yeah, right. And you see, like, there's nuance to some of these things. Like, there's methodologies to the process, and very, like, well-respected scholars. Ibn Hazm, rahimahullah, is seen as, like, a very prolific scholar, in particular for those who follow Salafi Islam, right? You wouldn't think that Salafism was, like, the school of thought who many of their kind of main shuyukh are the ones that are professing that somebody should have the ability to recant like forever. Do you know? Right? But the idea that somebody has this as an opinion is like it's still rooted in something evidentiary at the end of the day. And it goes back to like what we were talking about before. What's the point of Sharia? Its implementation is not in a vacuum, but it's meant to increase benefit and reduce detriment. You get to places where you start to like understand the bases of this, so that for people like us, no one is creating like aggressive doubts within us that are unhealthy, that make us say like, why does my religion say this? Do you know? But you don't ask that from a place of kind of I'm walking on eggshells with fragility. You ask it with a sense of understanding that if it's something that Allah and His Messenger allowed for, there's got to be something to it that I don't understand, and then I can try to figure that out, or I have contentment with the understanding that Allah and His Messenger know best. Do you know? But it's ingrained within supremacist systems to make minorities find validation through the systems that were built to hold them down. And that doesn't just come only through like the implementation of legal systems and like penal codes and law enforcement and who controls this and that, but it also is through the prism of knowledge acquisition. And one of the ways people remove identity from us is when they take away from us the desire and the motivation to learn about who we actually are from our own sources, or even learn it at all. And that then lends to a place where it has residual impact in terms of practice and in terms of connection to the divine and these kinds of things. Do you know? And so as we look at this hadith, it's giving us, different things. Oh, sorry guys, hold on one second. Assalamu alaikum. Oh my goodness, look at you. So happy, mashallah. Am I the first person you're FaceTiming? Can I have everyone in my halaqah? You can talk to all of them too. Guys, Kareem just got his own iMessaging app for the first time, and you're the first people he's ever FaceTiming from his own thing. Yeah, look at how happy he is. And he just hung up on me. Moving on already. What? Okay. So let's do this. We're not going to read this whole article. I think you should read it because like the initial sections also create a foundation for the rest of it, as it's talking about kind of how we understand some of these concepts. So, like, go home and read it, right? And if you aren't like prone to reading, they have an audio file as well. But I would say, like, from a pedagogical standpoint, until you learn about yourself, like how you learn the best. Some of us learn better by listening, some of us learn better by reading, some of us learn better like through conversations or experiential knowledge, right? And you can combine some of these things, do you know? So if you're listening to the audio as you're reading the article, you're also now engaging like two primary senses that are going to make it harder for anything else to distract you. So if you kind of get lost as you're reading it, like you're still hearing it, it's going to keep you on track and vice versa. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So let's take a couple of minutes before we wrap up. What are like we taking away from today's conversation? What's kind of coming up for people? And then we'll come back and discuss. They'll make a couple of announcements and then we'll wrap up for today. But go ahead.
Sorry if it's annoying. No, I don't mind.
I feel like everybody's expecting me to go first. Take away. My takeaway, I feel like it's pretty much said. Combat arguments to highly let somebody else and I'll ping pong on. I haven't heard from you one too.
I think it's very important. We live in a society that's not like all against us, but sometimes you feel it directly and we don't. Ideology is just wrong everywhere it is. So like obligation to know how to defend your ideology, you're prone to losing it at any moment. Like a single word can sway you. And I think that's like a growth in our house. In the Arab, even Muslims, we don't have this feeling. They can't it's like all of it. Because they don't need to. No one's actually posing this question. No one thinks about this question. No one says, why is this thing? Which is a big issue because our social media is posing discussions to those people. Which is why we're seeing like, even for example, countries like the Gulf countries are facing a decrease in not apostasy, but more so like the Islamic part in people. Or like, yeah, because they're easily swayed by words from social media when they've never been trained. So people here, the scholars here, I think they preach more about how to answer these stuff. One of the scholars there. The scholars that don't know about social media.
It's like ignorance is bliss, right? You're never presented an argument, you don't know how to respond to it. And so if you're growing up in a Muslim society, nobody's commenting on Muslim beliefs, right? Because we're surrounded by people that's a multi-artist
Some people don't like outwardly against colleagues. They're not outwardly. Inside, you find a lot of like,
I was like, that's
notions that
very
some
important.
colleague of mine, I told them that I'm from the Middle East. At work, he's like, oh, that's the place where they marry children. They alter life. I looked at him like, doesn't happen. Like I told him, no, that's an animal. Not like Lord, you. So it's like you find that sometimes they're not words, but You're there as a representative, you're trying to show that the dilemma of all
A lot of times, especially in the West, when you say
Okay, so what are some of the things we're taking away from today's conversation? What's coming up? Yeah.
As a group over here, we were talking about the importance of learning our religion, right? And especially in the Western world, that we're often faced with people who just don't like Islam or just don't like Muslims, and they often bring up the same arguing points against Islam, right? So we were talking about the importance of learning how to be able to combat that, even if it's just one hadith, just know, just even the bare minimum to be able to at least go back and forth with them, to essentially just teach them, right? Because they're taught it in a bad light and very, like, how do you say it, like, I'm forgetting the word, but why am I forgetting the word? Propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda in the West, right? And we were talking about how for the people, when you come from a Muslim country, we're not used to having to defend Islam, right? Because everyone around you, they're all Muslim, they're not going to question you on certain topics. But in the Western world, it's something that you kind of have to do. Like, you don't have a choice. It somehow comes up, like preconceived notions the moment you mention that you're Muslim. Like someone over here, we were talking about how he was at work. Do you want to say it?
Sure. So, we were talking about people growing up, even not in America, even other countries where they grow up with this propaganda, and then they preconceived notions about you and about the word Islam and Muslims that they never vocalize. Like, you'll find colleagues and people, they have opinions and things, they never ask you, they never vocalize, they never say, even the way they treat you, it's as if they don't have those notions. It just only comes up in rare occasions. So at work, when I first joined, one colleague asked, like, we were having a conversation, and I said, I'm from the Middle East and that region, and he's like, oh, that's the place where old guys marry children. And that's, and then, but this guy's like he's came straight from Brazil, he's a nice guy, like, you don't expect it from that kind of guy. And I told him, like, I clarified to him that it's just plainly wrong, it doesn't happen, we're not just some, like, inhuman, animalistic types over there. But from the looks of this guy, you can't tell. So learning, I guess, I mean, this doesn't apply to this kind of propaganda is so clearly wrong. At least this example, that's easy to reply to, but others may be harder to reply to. Like, I think one we discussed is slavery in Islam, even the ridda punishments or the hudud punishments. They can come up, and they probably will come up. And if it's not to basically resolve the picture of Islam in others' minds, it's to at least make you satisfied, and I think it strengthens your faith. Because if you don't have any evidence or any, like, backup for your foundations, you can be swayed by any word, and that's a very, like, shaky foundation to live by.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Anything people talk about? Yeah.
So, talked about defending Islam and, like, dealing with other people's perceptions of it. But, like, for me, it's even taking a step back from that. So the way we were taught growing up, it was like, for a lot of people, there's quite a fear-based approach. So it's like, if you don't do this, then you're going to hell. And then even about apostasy, like, growing up, we were just taught that if you leave Islam, then that's it, like, you can be killed. So it's really important, I think, like, so this has been quite helpful, like, these past few weeks, because you're looking at it, so you're taking away that fear-based approach, and you're really going back to the foundations of it and what the principles behind it are.
Well, it's also like, who is it supposed to instill the fear in, right? The fear should be in the guy who's cheating on his wife and committing an affair, right? The guy who's willfully murdering people, or somebody who's going to suddenly become like a traitor to the broader experience. That's not any of, you know what I mean? That's not something that like a Sunday school teacher should be telling their Sunday school student, or like a parent should be telling their kid, do you know? Right? Other than like if you're trying to create an ethical sense in a child, I'm gonna tell my son, like, we do not like cheat in our religion. Do you know? I'm gonna tell my daughter, like, no man is like worth your time if he even thinks about like cheating on you. Do you get what I mean? Right? But like, who should that fear be instilled in as a deterrent is totally off base. Do you know? Does that make sense? Right? Yeah, and there's like systems and processes. Like it's not just like we're gonna just put it out there. So let's do this. Like the next hadith we're gonna look at is a hadith that you probably heard us talk about here at Jum'ah or other places. Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir falyakul khayran aw liyasmut. That whosoever believes in Allah on the last day, then let him utter good or be silent, right? And then the two other groups that the hadith mentions, the same idea, whoever believes in Allah on the last day, and it talks about doing ikram of your neighbor, like treating your neighbor well as treating the guest well, right? So whoever believes in Allah on the last day, let them speak good or be silent. Whoever believes in Allah on the last day, let them, treat their neighbor with ikram. Whoever like believes in Allah on the last day, let them treat the guest like with the same ikram, do you know? So this hadith 14 is sandwiched in hadith that are about character and conduct, right? It's supposed to inform ethical conduct. That's why Imam Nawawi has it in this section, because these hadith are still all about conduct and like informing behaviors. Do you see what I'm saying, right? So next Monday, we won't meet, right? Yeah. And the Monday after, the potential could be there on December 30th. But like, are people around on December 30th? It's a Monday. And we could potentially meet that day. But I don't know how many people are going to be around. Yeah, because we leave for Umrah on January 2nd, which is a Thursday. And so those few days before that could be a potential. But just by a quick show of hands, not even if like you're going to commit to coming, but how many people are going to be in New York on December 30th? Oh, so many of us. Great. Yeah. Okay. But then do people have like other commitments on Tuesday, like work, or going into, like, there's not going to be school for anybody who's in school, but does anybody have to go into like an office the next day? Because if we're going to do something on the 30th, it should probably like be something that isn't just a halakha, but maybe we have like a really, nice dinner or something, right? Given that we're all stuck in New York and everyone else is traveling to their fancy places without us. Okay, well, let's figure out that and see. But next week we won't. And then the Monday after the 30th, we might. And then on the 6th, we won't, because we'll be on Umrah. And then on the 13th, we likely will resume again going forward. But we'll put all of those in the emails that go out, so just look out for the emails. Okay. If you can like clarify for people, the IC right now is open for kind of religious programs, religious services, like Jum'ah, our daily prayers here, iftars, halaqat. But the other events that we have, just because the university's policies have shifted on it, our non-NYU community members, we're not able to have them come. So this is why like the tech panel we had on Friday got canceled, We had another event on Sunday with a OBGYN that got postponed as well. There's also only just a few days left in this semester anyway. The building is going to be closed from Friday evening until January 2nd or 3rd. But we'll open for Jum'ah on the 27th. So we're open for Jum'ah every Friday in the school year. We just have to pay to open the building for those hours. So if you're in the city on the 27th, we'll have Jum'ah and like a post-Jum'ah lunch as well. So try to come for that if you can, inshallah.